on moisture and other things we so desire. There was no doubt about it, the peacocks were dead. The drought had begun at the beginning of that year in 1678, that season when rain usually came over the plateau like a trusted lover who entered one's bed at precisely the same hour each night. The nights were turning cold again. It was that desert night chill that plunged like an arrow into skin and made even the most eloquent poets stutter and skip over words. Shah Soleiman was the ruler of the Persians, not just the Shiite Muslims, if that's what's crossing your minds, but the Jews, Zoroastrians, Armenians, and even the Sunnis who'd made a home out of this land too. But what a life it was for these non-Shiites who were considered to be dog-like, infested with diseases that had crawled inside their brains and altered something of its chemistry to make them resist joining Ali's religious party. It was really no life at all. For many, it was a choice, as life always is, conversion or expulsion. New converts were rewarded with money because, as it turned out, money could in fact buy you out of your God. Water remained blind to such distinctions, and in the end, all were deprived. Corn prices had skyrocketed, goats and sheep and the chickens that ran around and clucked all day long became nothing but a haphazard collection of bones. They were desperate times, and so they called for desperate measures. All were invited to the Shah's court to pray. The men gathered in the courtyard where the peacocks once roamed, but were now nothing but carcasses molting under the day's heat, other less noble birds pecking at their organs. Men were too exhausted to dig through this hardened earth and give these once majestic birds a proper burial. The trees had once been green too, but were now barren and chaotic with their curved limbs. Musa, the Jew, with his tattered strings that hung from his waist, his long beard and eyes that drooped in a permanent state of sadness, stood bowing back and forth, his feet dirty just the way he liked them because he enjoyed nothing more in this life than walking barefoot. When asked once by his son why, he had replied, "When my feet are connected to the earth in such a way, every step I take reminds me of the lightness of my own being, that this is just a body, and we are so much more than a body, my boy. And I must say, I do have the most beautiful feet in the world, don't you think?" Armin, the Armenian, with a mustache so thin it looked to be meticulously drawn above his lips with ink and ears so big that they flapped even though there was no wind, closed his eyes and lowered his head as he prayed to Sargis, who answers the call of those in distress. When his wife had asked him about the size of his ears on their wedding night years before and if they ever got in the way of his lovemaking, his response had been simply, "Don't be silly, my dear. God gave me such ears to hear him better with, and nothing ever gets in the way of me and my lovemaking." There were too many men, and so Armin and Musa stood quite close to one another. Abadi, the Zoroastrian, also stood next to them, but a little further away since he was experiencing horrible gas and felt embarrassed by it. Abadi always held a drum in his hands and thumped the thing as he prayed. Ali, the Sunni, wore a red cloth wrapped around his long hair and prayed to Allah, the Supreme and All-Powerful One. And Muhammad, the Shiite, who was a close confidant of Shah Soleiman, wore something yellow that looked like a woman's dress, except it wasn't a dress because Muhammad the Shiite was a man, so we shall call it a robe of sorts. He also prayed to Allah, the Supreme and All-Powerful One. In the end, even if they didn't wish to see it and still don't wish to see it, it was all the same and would in essence always be the same. Words and breath and hope reaching out to the heavens, to the universe, believing that if they did it right, there would always be an answer waiting for them. Hundreds gathered inside the overheated courtyard, the feet of those who had taken their shoes off burned from the hot cement, but not our dear Musa, whose feet were planted firmly on that ground. His body didn't wriggle or twist itself to relieve the scalding pain. He looked like a man at peace with everything God would send his way, and he knew that, like most things in life, he wouldn't always have a say in it. Not even the Shah himself had enough water to keep himself quenched, and he even considered once or twice drinking the dirtied old water of his shisha pipe. It was a rare occasion to have this interfaith assembly and would perhaps only happen again in Zora Khanum's brothel, where the rooms were so small that no man's God was allowed to enter. Just then, Muhammad the Shiite sneezed, sending his dress/robe flapping as the force almost knocked him down to his knees. The snot in his hands was the only moisture he had felt in months, and so he rubbed his callous hands furiously with it. He sneezed every time he came close to a non-Shiite and considered himself to be allergic. With his eyes open to a slit, he speculated the others as he snot rubbed his hands. Everyone seemed so focused and hypnotized by his own God. He could hear other languages being whispered, gurgling inside throats, and men holding books in their hands and writing he was unfamiliar with. Musa the Jew and Armin the Armenian seemed to be standing a little too close to each other, closer than the other men were at least. They appeared as two people who had entered this world through the same tunnel. Perhaps they were planning their rebellion. Perhaps they'd hoarded all the water and were secretly keeping it away from the others, creating this landscape of utter and complete desperation so they could finally get the power their greedy souls desired. The two men made Muhammad nervous, and the sneezing, loud and violent, wouldn't cease. He lowered to his knees each time, his head pounding from the intensity of it, and pretended that this was a new form of prayer. Shah Soleiman opened his eyes, annoyed, searching for the culprit. He glanced over at Muhammad and then smiled as he caught his eyes and put a finger towards his lips, urging him into silence, the way a lover would someone who was making far too many pleasurable noises. The men prayed as the sun fell asleep and the moon brought its momentary relief until the shivering began. It felt like another world to them. The heat of the day, nothing but a memory or a bad dream. But the sun soon returned and taunted them with its harsh rays yet again. And when the sound of roaring bellies overpowered the communion of prayer, the Shah announced a break seemed necessary, so the men were told to return the following morning to continue their prayers. Maybe it was the deliriousness of dehydration that had overtaken Muhammad's already minuscule brain, but as Shah Soleiman bathed that evening with the last of the dirtied river water, enough only to cover his legs and his rear, Muhammad approached him. Your Highness, it has become apparent to me that Musa the Jew and Armin the Armenian are conspiring against us. Their prayers appeared loud and strong and unified, and I worry that they could have nullified the voices and requests of our fellow Shiites. I believe they may be hoarding all the water. Shah Soleiman sipped on the very last drops of his wine. He saw two Muhammads, both so beautiful with eyes blue, soft and bird-like, his dress/robe like canary wings reaching out, begging for an embrace. The Shah invited him to get undressed and to join him. It wasn't the first time. But the water, Muhammad said, hesitating, and then peeking inside to get a better glimpse of the brown liquid. His ruler's large penis seemed to extend like a claw, opening and closing with each breath he took. Don't be a fool. There is enough for two, the Shah insisted. And Muhammad accepted because who says no to Shah Soleiman? And he allowed the Shah to touch him in a way that Muhammad did not understand. Not even a woman had touched him in such a way, cradling him as if he was a child, pressing his lips to Muhammad's neck, stroking the bulge between his legs until Muhammad felt he could not contain whatever ugly spit had gathered up inside of him. It is pure if you do it for your leader, the Shah whispered in his ear. Allah would approve of this, he told Muhammad right after the wetness had been released, and Muhammad felt like a child, naked and waiting for a spanking from his mother. But he had left her so long ago, hadn't seen her since he was a young boy, and now he'd forgotten most everything about her except the rough way she used to beat him. But Musa and Armin, what will we do with them, Shah Soleiman? Kiss me and I will tell you, the Shah insisted, and his burgundy parched lips looked as if painted with rouge as they touched those of Muhammad's and turned them into a similar bloody color. The next day, the men were ordered instead to meet in the public square, where Musa the Jew and Armin the Armenian would be executed. 2 arrows went soaring into both their beating hearts, and as Muhammad looked on satisfied, his stomach turned with the bile of unanswered questions. He thought of his mother and what she had told him so long ago after she spanked his bare bottom for throwing rocks at the Jewish kids who lived next to them, as Muhammad had almost blinded one. All are loved, you stupid, hateful boy. With God, all are loved, she'd screeched at him. And Muhammad had forgotten it, just as he'd forgotten the sweetness of her breath and the kindness that washed over her after the blood had started to flow from his skin and she realized she was actually harming him. And then she kissed his forehead and held him in her lap, his pants still around his ankles, and rocked him gently until his tears had stopped pouring, whispering in his ear, all are loved, even you, even this good boy of mine. You are loved too. Musa and Armin continued their prayers until their final breaths, because that was just the kind of men they were. Their bodies still and at peace, as the blood-soaked arrows now looked like newly acquired limbs they hadn't asked for at all. Musa's bare feet sparkled as if freshly bathed, and really they were the most beautiful feet anyone had ever seen. And Armin's mustache disappeared as if someone had taken a wet cloth to it while his ears listened closely. The sky opened up just as Muhammad let out a violent sneeze that sounded more like a scream than anything else. "The bear has exploded," his mother would always tell him after his alarming sneezes. "My fat little bear has exploded." Who needed a mother when you had a God? He sneezed again and again and again until he felt his head would explode, and it was only then that the rain finally began to pour. Thank you.